Today's Spain, where everywhere you see churches and the glory of Christian Europe shines bright. But do you know that this very Spain was once the brightest center of Islam, a land from where Europe learnt knowledge, science, and literature, a land which the world remembers as Andalus. The story begins in the year 711, when a young and brave commander of Islam, Tariq ibn Ziyad radiallahu anhu, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with a small army. Just imagine, only 7,000 soldiers facing the mighty Visigoth kingdom of Spain. But Tariq ibn Ziyad radiallahu anhu had something greater than numbers. He had unshakable faith. When his army reached the shores of Spain, Tariq gave an order that shocked everyone. He commanded to burn the ships. The soldiers were surprised. They asked, "Commander, how will we return now?" Tariq replied with words that echoed through history. "Behind you is the sea, and in front of you is the enemy. By Allah, there is no way back except victory." These words lit such a fire in the hearts of the Muslim soldiers that with only a few thousand men, they defeated an army of tens of thousands. The Battle of Guadalete became the turning point, and soon the doors of Spain opened for Islam. Within a few years, the banner of Islam was raised in Córdoba, Seville, and Toledo, and Spain became Al-Andalus, a land where a new chapter of history was about to begin. The battle was won, but the real victory only happens when a man wins the heart of his enemy. And the Muslims of Andalus understood this deeply. They did not enlighten Spain only with the sword, but with knowledge, culture, and humanity. Córdoba, a city that became the shining star of Europe. At that time, it was just a dark village, its streets filled with mud and darkness. But Córdoba's streets glowed with lamps at night. The roads were clean, canals of water flowed, and in the evenings, people would sit in gardens talking about poetry and knowledge. And what about libraries? In most villages of Europe, people did not even know how to write their own names. But in Córdoba's libraries, there were hundreds of thousands of books. The scholars of Andalus used to say, "Do not just keep the light of knowledge, share it." And from here began the bright journey of Andalus. The scholars and scientists of Andalus, such as Al-Zahrawi, known today as the father of surgery. Just imagine, at that time, when Europe's doctors used to treat patients by draining blood, Al-Zahrawi was creating new instruments for operations. He designed more than 200 surgical tools, some of which are still used in modern medicine today. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, the king of philosophy. He explained Aristotle's theories and taught Europe the art of logic and reasoning. Ibn Hazm, the star of literature and jurisprudence. His books did not remain limited only to Muslim libraries. Even Europe's Christian scholars translated them into their own languages. These were not just names. They were the symbols of a great civilization. And it wasn't only about scholars. There were also the magnificent structures of Andalus, the great mosque of Córdoba, where at one time 40,000 people prayed together, and then the Alhambra Palace of Granada, whose gardens reminded one of paradise itself. But the most amazing thing was that the knowledge of Andalus did not remain limited to Muslims. Christian students came here too. They learned Arabic and translated books into their own languages, and from there began Europe's Renaissance. Just imagine, if Andalus had not existed, perhaps Europe would never have reached the Renaissance. Neither today's science nor today's modern Europe would have existed. Andalus had become a paradise, a land of knowledge, light, culture, and justice. But history is witness to one truth. Where light becomes brighter, there also darkness finds its way. And slowly, the light of Andalus began to fade. The golden age was at its peak. Córdoba was shining, the libraries were filled with knowledge, and the world saw Andalus as a paradise. But inside, a poison was spreading. A poison that would shatter this paradise. The first poison, division. When the Muslims were united, they conquered Spain, built it, and filled it with light. But as time passed, Andalus began to break apart. The Caliph of Córdoba grew weaker, and the land was divided into small taifa states. Every city had its own king, its own throne, its own flag. Just imagine, one nation, but every ruler thinking himself the greatest, fighting among themselves, politics, greed, and arrogance. And when one nation fights among itself, the enemy doesn't even need to raise a sword. The Christians from the north took full advantage of this. They slowly began pushing forward. Step by step, city by city, Muslims were driven back. But the greatest tragedy was this, that Muslim rulers themselves joined hands with Christian enemies to fight against their own Muslim brothers. Just imagine, the same land where once the Quran and books of knowledge shined bright was now filled with Muslims fighting each other. And then came that moment when the very heart of Andalus was broken. Toledo, once the pride of Muslim Spain, fell into the hands of Christian Europe. In Toledo's libraries, there were copies of the Quran, books of science, and treasures of knowledge, but they were either burned or looted, and sent towards Europe. One by one, Andalus continued to break apart. Cordoba, which was once the light of Europe, drowned into darkness because of internal wars and divisions. The streets that once glowed with lamps now turned silent and weak because of war and bloodshed. The light of the Muslims slowly began to fade. Knowledge and culture were still alive, but the rulers were so lost in politics and a struggle for power that they no longer had the strength to stand against the enemy's conspiracies. There was once a nation that was lighting up the whole world, but now that same nation was drowning in its own darkness. The brightest light shines just before the end, and for Andalus, that was its final shine, the city of Granada. Granada was a beautiful city. Its gardens, fountains, and palaces were incredibly stunning, and its greatest pride, the Alhambra Palace, made of red stone. This fortress was a symbol of the greatness of the Muslims, but Granada was a fortress standing at the edge of the sea, surrounded on all sides by enemies. The Christian siege. From the north, Ferdinand and Isabella's Christian army surrounded Granada. All the Muslim rulers of Andalus had either been defeated or had surrendered to the Christians. Only Granada remained, the last stronghold of Islam in Spain. But even inside Granada, a poison had spread: internal hatred and politics. King Abu Abdullah Muhammad, or Abdil, was fighting battles within his own family. And when rulers fight among themselves, victory becomes easy for the enemy. The year was 2nd January 1492. The fortress of Granada was handed over to the Christian army. The flag of Islam was lowered from the towers of Alhambra. Imagine, where once the recitation of the Quran echoed, now the sound of bells rang through the city. And as Abu Abdullah left Granada, he stopped on a hill and looked back at the city. Tears fell from his eyes. His mother said to him, "Why do you cry? The crown that you could not protect as a man, you now weep for it as a woman?" These words were not just a mother's scolding. They were the grief of an entire nation. With the fall of Granada, Andalus came to an end. A land that was once the center of Quran, science, and art was now taken from the Muslims. Millions of Muslims were killed, and those who survived were forced to abandon their religion and adopt Christianity. The fall of Andalus gave Muslims a lesson. When a nation turns away from the Quran and divides itself from within, even the greatest power in the world cannot save it. After the fall of Granada, the story did not end. The real story had just begun, a story of pain, oppression, and tears. The year was 1492. In Spain, a new law was made: either adopt Christianity or embrace death. And to enforce this law, a terrifying court was created, the Spanish Inquisition. Just imagine, a nation that was once giving knowledge and humanity to the world, that once gifted Europe the Renaissance, had now become a scene of burning bodies and fear. The suffering of the Muslims of Andalus serves as a mirror for us today. It reminds us that true power is not in buildings or swords. True strength comes from a connection with the Quran and unity among the people. And today, when we hear the story of Andalus, a question rises from the heart. Are we following the same path? Are we too moving away from the Quran, fighting among ourselves and repeating the history of our forefathers?